internet is.
Man.
Okay, all right. I can't see with this
can't
one.
do it.
I can't. Hey everybody! Hey, it's Friday. I don't know if anybody saw the news, but the 32 CFR CMMC final rule is finally out.
It is here.
Just a couple hours later.
We did not plan this at all. Jacob and I were talking. Worst case scenario is it drops while I'm in Chicago and you're in Pacific time zone.
Yeah,
right before the Q&A here.
The only thing I love more is, in rulemaking season is waking up at 5 a.m. every day to check, the random obscure government websites to see if there have been actual updates. But yes, before you ask, feel free to ask. But before you ask, yes, this is necessary. Yes, this is necessary. This is not. This is not us like coping with the latent stress of waiting for the rule to be published for weeks and weeks and weeks. Daniel, you and I, not even just weeks, you and I have been waiting for this rule to be published for literal years at this point.
I came to been we were just caring about this little DFARS thing, and then all of a sudden the CMMC dropped and it feels like we've been here in limbo forever.
Yeah. According to my calculations, if my math is correct, the process of announcing CMMC 2.0 rulemaking occurred on November 7th, 2021. Wow. And so today, with the PDF version of the final rule being published, we are, let's see here, 2 years, 11 months, and 8 days later. And here we are. Fun fact, though, at the time when they announced CMMC 2.0, they estimated that it would take them up to 24 months to get through that rulemaking process for 32 CFR. So if you zoom out, they slipped their schedule by less than a year, which is pretty good for the fact that this whole thing is so humongous and the amount of time and effort that it takes to get through it. So missing your longest estimate by 11-ish months, not so bad. There's a lot of companies out there that are going to be missing their estimates for implementation by longer than 11 months. So let's not throw stones while we're all in glass houses, everybody. You know what I'm saying?
That was the crazy thing. I was having conversations this week about implementation timelines of other companies, that specialize in this implementation. And they're talking like end of Q1 next year to be able to start, 8 to 10 months, because I guess everyone's kind of been bum rushed, right? It's like everyone's got real nervous real fast. So one of the things that we're seeing a lot of is these implementation backlogs at all of these different companies that consult and help and do this kind of work are growing rapidly. And that's not C3PAOs. That's technical, hands-on keyboards, turning the dials kind of organizations like ourselves. So it is getting pretty crazy out there, and it's only just started.
Yeah. And so just to reiterate this for everybody, I mean, this is a point that we've made on the podcast. This is a point we've made at CS2. This is a point that we've made in blogs, in posts, in events, on the corner of the street, flipping signs to raise awareness, is that the primary constraint on CMMC is not the number of assessors to get people through assessment. The primary constraint is how much capacity there is in implementation to get you ready for assessment. And there isn't enough implementation capacity in the ecosystem for everyone to wait until the last minute to get started on projects that take months, sometimes many, many months to get all the way through. And so what you're saying is that we are currently hearing on the phone from people calling us eager. This was pre-rule publication.
This was a few days ago. Yeah.
Eager to get started, saying that they are hearing from other implementers in the ecosystem that their implementation backlog is stretching 8 to 10 months to get started.
Yeah, it's crazy right now.
On top of that, right, most of the C3PAOs that we know are booked until May of next year. So if you do the math, right, then waiting to get started is going to make this line longer and longer. And you won't be able to blame the lack of assessment capacity on your inability to get a certification if you haven't been fully implemented yet, because you'll be able to see how long the backlog is for the C3PAOs. And if it's shorter than what you're telling your customers as to when you'll get ready, then it's immediately apparent that your implementation is taking longer than your assessment.
Absolutely. And I mean, we got a little bit of grace with the extension of phase one, which we'll talk about, I think, with the CMMC final rule, but still extending another 6 months doesn't help when your journey could be 12 to 18 to get implemented. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't even really know where to start. I am in a dopamine induced haze right now. I got a lot of big feelings about what's going on with the rule. It's finally out. It's 470 pages long. I think it's somewhere north of like 130 or 140,000 words, which, if I remember correctly, is longer than Homer's The Odyssey and like on par with some of the later Harry Potter books.
Goblet of Fire, CMMC edition.
It is pretty long. Now, the nice part, though, is that, the way that the rules are structured, most of that is preamble, right? Yeah. Most of that is analysis, estimates, public comment responses, and summaries of the actual text of excuse me. I'm getting choked up. Of the actual policy that's expressed in the rule itself, which I think is only like the last 85 pages or so. Now, it's important to read the entire thing because the rationale of the DoD is what is contained in the preamble. So all the why, all the reasons that they made the decisions that they did are documented and sometimes even buried, and you kind of got to dig them out in that preamble to the rule. But the actual policy itself is pretty straightforward. And a lot of the stuff in the policy, from what I can tell, having skimmed the rule so far, very similar to the proposed rule. I mean, this is exactly what we talked about when the proposed rule came out. This is exactly what we talked about when we were talking about how quickly they got through the volume of public comments, in the sense that we didn't expect major shifts in policy between the proposed rule and the final rule. Now, there are changes, there's adjustments, there's things here and there. If you've skimmed through the rule, or if you've been on LinkedIn this morning, there's people posting about it. Like, I mean, I can't even keep up right now. So little things like, the first phase of the rollout is now 12 months instead of 6 months, or things like that. But like the controls that can go on a POAM, how long a POAM is, the criteria, the number of levels, like the big pieces of the policy are generally the same as they were, which for those of you keeping score at home, right? They went from proposed rule at the end of 2023 to final rule today, October of 2024, 29% faster than the average DoD rule takes to go from proposed to final, dating all the way back to 2009. This is easily the biggest, most attention-grabbing rule that the DoD has issued, I think, ever. Normally rules like this get a lot of attention for other agencies that have public-facing regulations. The DoD generally doesn't get that level of attention, but they went through it, and they went through it extremely quickly. So people for a long time, what I've noticed, like in the comments and stuff, is people have been lamenting how long the process has taken. But there's a lot more people talking about how long the process has taken than are in line for assessments or who have gone through joint surveillance assessments. So I really hope that people have used the last 2 years and 11 months to fully implement the requirements that have been required for, 6 years and 9 months. This is a program that is verifying the implementation of requirements that have been required now for almost 7 years. So when the final rule is out, and as we get through the last pieces of red tape and then the rollout begins, that's the point where DoD is not going to listen to people when they say we haven't had enough time. They're going to go, what were you doing for the last 3 years? What were you doing for the last 7 years? That's what all that time beforehand was for.
I've seen a lot of NIST implementations in my day, and I can tell you I haven't seen one reach 7 years yet. So if they're still working on it after 7 years, there might be a little bit of a
we were talking about this the other day. We were talking about this the other day. We've never had a full-blown CMMC overhaul implementation project all the way from soup to nuts take longer than the amount of time that we've gone from proposed rule to final rule, which means if you had started
Yep.
at some point when the proposed rule had started, then you would be done and ready to go, right? So everyone now is going to be stuck scrambling, hence the lights, hence the get up,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
It's an emergency now, right? This is an
It is.
emergency.
we're DEFCON status over here.
It is no longer speculation. It's no longer memes on LinkedIn. I mean, there's going to be a
Nope.
lot of memes on
Oh,
LinkedIn,
yeah.
but this is real. This is really real. This is the final rule. This is the thing that they announced at the end of 2021. It's done.
It
It's
happened.
over.
Yep.
It's an official DoD policy now. It is codified in black and white on the books, ready to go. So for everybody who was waiting, for everybody who's trying to time it, for everybody who was gambling, this is the shoe that you've been waiting to drop. This is it.
It dropped.
It dropped.
Yep.
All right. Let's see here. So one of the things that you brought up, Daniel, was VDI being out of scope in the rule. We've only had a chance to skim through the rule. We're just going to kind of dig through it as quickly as we can here. I'm sure people will have questions, but one of the things that you mentioned that jumped out to you was VDI out of scope. You want to talk about that?
I do. So actually, I'll do a little screen share here.
Awesome.
And one of the things that's been a point of contention for ever, basically at this point, is virtual desktop, the endpoint accessing the virtual desktop in or out of scope? Is it a CRMA? Is it out of scope? Is it a CUI asset? Is it, an SPA or something like that? And the good news is on page 452 under CMMC L2 assets or scoping guidance, it says assets that fall into any in-scope asset category cannot be considered an out-of-scope asset. There's the words. An endpoint hosting a VDI client configured to not allow any processing, storage, or transmission of CUI beyond the keyboard, video, and mouse sent to the VDI client is considered an out-of-scope asset. And I know for many people, finally having that clarity, because DIBCAC's assessed it differently, C3PAOs have assessed it differently, DoD CIO has given me different responses. So it's nice to officially have codified in the final rule what actually happens with virtual desktops.
Absolutely. And just to make this point here, right? The final rule is the final rule, meaning that this is the policy. So anything that was expressed in the proposed rule, anything that was expressed at any time before today is overwritten by what's in this rule, right? This is the final rule. So that is the first place to go for answers. Things like the FAQs, things like, let's see here, let me get rid of this. Things like the FAQs, things like, advisory documents, whatever you come across, right? If it was dated before the final rule and there's a discrepancy, then you default to the final rule until those things are updated, because the policy is the final rule. It's very interesting to read the proposed rules. Don't get me wrong. It's one of my favorite things to do. Very interesting to see how things have changed, to see the consistency and interpretation in DoD policy over time. But as far as the policy is concerned, for what is and isn't allowed, for what current valid DoD guidance is on interpretations for whatever topic, it is the guidance that is in this rule, the rule that was released today. Okay, so I had numerous people ask me about this via DM this morning. I haven't had a chance to keep up with everything on LinkedIn. It's going crazy. If you've messaged me and I haven't seen it yet, I'm sorry. I'll catch up eventually. But the first question that everybody asks is, okay, this is the policy rule. This is 32 CFR. When is it in contracts? Because this rule talks about a phased rollout, right? Yep. Well, if you look closely at the section where they talk about the phased rollout, the requirement to achieve a certain CMMC level will start to show up in contracts after the effective date of the 48 CFR CMMC final rule. This is the 32 CFR CMMC proposed rule. So we're going to have to do this whole get up one more time, which is good because then I can expense all these costs. Anyways, apparently heavy duty LED road flares are quite expensive. Anywho, so the phased rollout for when it starts to be inserted into contracts starts from the effective date of the 48 CFR rule. Now, if you're just listening to this or you're like, I'm not going to remember this, we put it in chat. We are having a webinar November 7th. We're going to have all this visualized. We'll have it all summarized. We'll have it all nice, neat, cleaned, packaged up, good to go. Everything you need to know for rollouts, dates, timelines, maps, all that stuff. So register for that webinar. Don't worry about having to remember everything. Don't worry about having to read through all 500 pages of this thing in the next few hours. We got you covered in a couple weeks at the first week of November 7th. Anyways, back to the story. The phased rollout that DoD is talking about occurs in what they call 4 phases. Basically, every calendar year after the effective date of the 48 CFR rule is when they start to introduce the various levels of CMMC into contracts. So the 48 CFR final rule becomes effective, and then for the next 12 months after that, it's all level 1 CMMC assessments, and at DoD's discretion, level 2 certification assessments. And then at the end of that calendar year, they go into phase 2, and that's when level 2 certification assessments are in all new DoD solicitations, and level 3 is at DoD discretion, right?
Yep.
And then on and on and on. And then on the 4th calendar year, they're at full implementation where all the requirements are in all contracts, all option years, all stuff like that. And they're at full implementation. Now, they estimate that the amount of time that it will take for all of the requirements to end up in all contracts would take 7 years because of the time it takes for all the contracts to age off. So sometimes you'll hear, oh, the rollout is 7 years. The rollout is 4 years. It's a 4-phase rollout. It's because of when they're inserting the requirements and how much time it takes to catch up with all of the contracts. The real part that matters is that it's all up to their discretion,
Right.
and they have no real mechanism for explaining how that discretion is going to work. So there's no way for you to predict which one of those phases you're going to end up in. There's going to be plenty of people who are going to have level 2 certification requirements right when this thing starts because it's up to DoD discretion. And if you work for the primes, then the rollout is irrelevant because they can require you to go do it. Well, they could start to require you to go do it right now because it exists. So yeah, the phase rollout, take it with a grain of salt, but we'll have that whole diagram and visual for what's going on. But
it'll be fascinating how quick Lockheed does a webinar saying, hey guys, you got to go do this thing now if you want to be a supplier of ours, right?
Yeah.
Like, it'll be very interesting to see what their aggressive timeline will end up looking like.
Yeah, I would love it. I would love it. Now, chances are they're probably going to borrow a few of our slides from our webinar, but I would love it if they had some information. If you're watching at home, Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, everybody, how's it going? It would be really nice if you had a slide that explained what your rollout plans were going to be for your suppliers, rather than regurgitating the rollout plans for the DoD, which is irrelevant to what you're telling all of the people who work for you.
Yep.
All righty. Let's see here. Let's see what's going on in comments here. All right, Lawrence says the production value is super high. Thanks, Lawrence.
Hey, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Eric thought I was drinking Jack Daniels over here.
Yeah.
So
drinking Jack Daniels. We got emergency lights going on. Let's see here. Caffeine, highlighters, Post-its. Yeah, I got my Red Bull. We got all the supplies that we need here. Let's see. Brad said it looks like Mystery Science Theater 3000. If you don't know what that show is,
what a great reference, Brad.
If you don't know what that show is, ask your parents. All righty. Let's see here. Let's see. David says, it sounds like the assessment capacity number of C3PAOs may also be limited because CFR final rule have been delayed for so long. How does the federal government plan to address capacity lag? I mean, they're going to address it by the demand for certifications is going to go through the roof. And then a bunch of people are going to start C3PAOs. A bunch of people are going to go
money, right?
A bunch of people are going to go through training. The dynamic of how many C3PAOs there are is left up to market forces. They are not specifying a certain number. They are not, all the C3PAOs that we have right now are all the early adopters that got ready when there were no CMMC assessments to be done. And there's 60 now, something like that.
Yeah.
There's several hundred assessors. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of C3PAOs. And that was when there was zero demand. So how do they plan to address it? It's going to be through market forces. And based off of the response that we've seen so far in the last 4 hours, I would say that the market forces demand is going to be a perfectly fine catalyst for getting enough assessors. The problem, like we said, is not assessment capacity. It is not assessment capacity. The problem is implementation capacity. I cannot stress this enough. It will take you longer to go from where the average company is right now to assessment ready than it will if you get in line for a C3 PAO and they tell you we can't get started until May. I guarantee you that it will take you longer, especially as we were talking about earlier. We're hearing from other people, talking to other companies who do this kind of work, that their backlog is like 8 months. 8 months. There are a lot of companies, well, there's not a lot, but there are other companies who specialize in this work like we do, who are much smaller than us. They're significantly smaller than us, which means that their capacity is much smaller. So especially if you come across companies whose offerings are particularly inexpensive, it's generally because they are run through particularly small companies, which is great, except for the fact that they can't scale the amount of work that's necessary in order to help with this problem. So how do they plan to address it? Market forces. How do they plan to address the implementation problem? Market forces. The people who are already done with their JSVAs, the people who are already in line with their implementations finished for their C3 PAO assessments are probably sleeping pretty easy right now. For everybody else, like the many people who we have spoken to as recently as the last couple days. I mean, we were on a phone call with some people the other day, and we were saying, hey, there's a lot of chatter out there that this rule is getting ready to get published. It's out of regulatory review. This is what the historical numbers say. There's just a lot of smoke going on about this rule coming out, and they laughed. They laughed on the phone. They were like, yeah, sure.
Congress will delay it. Like, I mean, they were saying all sorts of stuff. I was on a call yesterday with a defense contractor, at least that's portions of their revenue, and they stumbled across this 7012 clause all of a sudden and this 7019 clause. And then I brought up CMMC and they were like, what's that? I'm like, what do you mean, what's that? I was like, tomorrow, very likely we might actually have something and it would tell you exactly what it is. You have to go get certified to this. So the fact that people are still just stumbling into DFAR 7012 24 hours ago, it is just shocking to me. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens.
I mean, no judgment. Listen, no judgment. We've talked about this before. Business is about taking risks.
That's right.
And, people decided that they were going to take a risk on the regulation. They thought it was going to zig. Instead, it has zagged.
It zagged hard.
And now, you are left with a situation that you have to manage. And it's not an unmanageable situation. This is something that, I've heard you say this more than anybody. CMMC is a perfectly achievable thing. Like, it's not impossible.
No.
It's not impossible. It's just a lot more annoying and precarious to wait until the last minute, like anything else. It's not unique to CMMC. But, there's just a lot of people who maybe over the course of the last 3 years let some confirmation bias set in, and they kind of forgot about what the details were and how the whole thing works. And now they're with this signal starting over from zero. What is CMMC? What is DFAR 7012? What is 800-171? What are POAMs? It's Groundhog Day. We're right back where we were in November of 2020 when the original CMMC rule came out, and that's totally fine. We got a lot of practice.
You can be early, you can be late, but you can't be on time. We've now crossed the threshold of the on time statement. Finally.
Yeah, absolutely. We are now past the point of you being able to be early.
That's right.
Absolutely. All right, let's see. Michael says, "Love the PPE. Gotta stay safe, everybody. Make sure you're hydrating this weekend while you're watching Game 5 of the Padres versus the Dodgers. It's Columbus Day weekend. There's postseason baseball. Final rules are happening. The leaves are turning colors. What a delightful
pumpkin
time
spice
of year.
Season in full swing, Jacob.
What a delightful time of year. Scott loves the lights. Scott couldn't be here today. He'll be here on another episode soon. Scott, we can't wait to hear from you.
We can't wait.
We can't wait. All right, let's see here. What else do we have? Let's see. Okay, so somebody was messaging me about this the other day, and it is a significant part of the rule. What the heck is the deal with CMMC level 2 self-assessments?
What is that?
And the message that I got, the question that I got was, I thought the whole point of CMMC was to implement external assessments on people. What's the deal with level 2 self-assessments? I don't know if you have any thoughts, Daniel, before I go into my rant.
Yeah, I think the DoD just wants an out, right? They want the ability to flex this if they need to, and it allows them to push out the roll down, the rollout process, right? They get to kind of throw at their discretion certifications in phase one. Most of it allows self-assessments. I think it's just them buying time a little bit and them having an out if and when they want to use it. I don't expect it to be used very heavily once towards the end of phase one into phase two, though.
Yeah. If everybody gather around, kids, and let me tell you a story back from 2021 when dinosaurs roamed the earth and the DoD announced CMMC 2.0 and they said, okay, we get it, right? Remember, CMMC emerged out of a series of massive, horrible compromises to critical DoD weapon systems at the hands of contractor unclassified networks, right? And so everybody was very, very upset about what was going on. And that was reflected in the policy that came out with the original CMMC rule where they were like, no POAMs, no nothing, all or nothing. We got
nuclear on it. Yeah.
they were pissed, right? And rightly so. And there was a lot of backlash to that. They went through and did their review in 2021 and they announced 2.0 at the end of 2021. And one of the primary features was level 2 bifurcation. Bifurcation. If anybody remembers bifurcation, let us know in the chat who's been here for a while. And bifurcation was this idea that at level 2, there would be certain types of CUI that the DoD cared about. And there'd be certain types of CUI that the DoD didn't care about. And for the types of they didn't use those words, but that's what was implied. And for those types of CUI that they didn't care about, you would be able to self-assess at level 2, even though the entire point of the CMC program was a result of the fact that self-assessments don't freaking work.
Yeah.
They don't work. And so everybody immediately said, how's that going to work? How will you know? Blah, blah, blah. And it became very apparent immediately that the DoD didn't know. It is a true fact. It is a fact on paper that the ability to have a level 2 self-assessment could possibly exist. Whether that will exist for you is probably a 0% chance, right?
How many people use that waiver, by the way? Like,
yeah. I mean, the odds of you only having a single acquisition that you're dealing with or everything that you're dealing with, allowing you to have a level 2 self-assessment are basically 0. This is as bad of a bet as it was to bet that the rule wasn't going to happen. I'll put it to you that way, right? It is not a realistic thing for you to base the idea off of, we'll be allowed to self-assess. It's just not going to happen.
Well, we've had tons of clients say, hey, I'm just going to wait. I can self-assess. And they've had this in their brain for years. It's like, okay, that's a risk. And it's obviously a very high risk as the final rule has shown. So
and there's even some new language in there that I saw. I don't remember if it was in the proposed rule or not. We'll have to tease it out where they say, and if you do get a self-assessment, we reserve the right under DFAR 7019 and 7020 to come by and check your work. So I would imagine that even in the situation where you're allowed to self-assess, they're still going to show up and check your work one way or another. It is not a reliable strategy to bet that you will be allowed to self-assess. Just like you were talking about before, it is not a reliable strategy to rely on the idea of waivers.
No.
As we've talked about multiple times, we had a video that came out about this the other day. You're not getting a waiver for CMMC because CMMC waivers, as you have pointed out, Daniel, occur at the contract level. The entire contract.
Level. Yeah, exactly.
The entire contract for F-35 cockpit refresh is exempt from CMMC, not this one sub-tier supplier who happens to be working on it can't afford it, so they're getting a waiver. That's not how that's going to work, right? And so relying on the idea that you're going to get a waiver to get out of CMMC, not a viable strategy moving forward.
Nope. I love Ingrid's comment. Can I just throw a straight 110? I should be okay. No.
Oh man. What a great and relevant man. I know where she's getting that one from. I know where she's getting that one from.
Too.
folks who are on LinkedIn quite often will know the reference here. If you see someone telling you just upload a 110 into the system, don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. You will be mocked and ridiculed and potentially in deep trouble under the False Claims Act as a result. Okay, so one thing on the 110, though, it is a good point that Ingrid brings up. One thing on the 110, there is a scoring system for CMMC. Yep. There was a scoring system in the proposed rule. There is a scoring system now in the final rule. It is the same scoring system that you've had for your SPRS score, where they take the various requirements in NIST SP 800-171 and they give them weights, 5 points, 3 points, 1 point. And then based off of evaluating whether your controls have been fully implemented, you get the points or you don't on a scale of 110 on the perfect side, negative 203 on the 0% implemented side. So your CMMC score is your SPRS score. Your SPRS score is your CMMC score. Check the rule for all the scoring details. Do not just upload a perfect 110 score in SPRS in the interim time period here. That is not a good policy. All righty, let's see here. Raul Mendoza. I worked for Raul Mendoza when I was in the Navy. He was my division chief when I checked in at NIOC San Diego. So good to see you, man. I'm glad.
You never know who you're going to run into on LinkedIn live streams, do you, Jacob?
It's great. Clearly a great professional influence on my my career trajectory here, because I'm wearing this clown suit on a LinkedIn live session. All righty, let's see here. Somebody had a question about can you speak to changes for MSPs, external service providers, in the final rule if you've had a chance to review that part? Daniel, have you had a chance to look at that yet?
I did take a peek at it. So MSPs, if they just have security protection data, no longer have to be certified. That Correct. Is brand new. That's shaking ground for everybody. Like, they're finally ready and finally happy that SPD does not equate to a CMMC L2 certification. If your MSP uses tools that process, store, or transmit CUI, those tools are going to be in scope of all of the things. Backups, RMM tools, screenshots, EDR. So, I say all that to say, yes, MSPs getting a proper certification because of security protection data, no longer a thing. Fantastic. However, their tool stack and their tech stack, which we've been saying for years, even before the proposed rule, would likely be in scope because of CUI that those handle, right? So you're dodging a bullet one way, but there's still kind of another spin on it, where you got to make sure not only does your MSP have a shared responsibility matrix, but they're using, at least with CUI data, they're using FedRAMP tools and potentially tools with US persons support as well if it's export control data. So yeah, good news and kind of mixed bad news. You still got to do a lot of due diligence to make sure that you're picking a good MSP.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that, it was a surprise when the proposed rule came out as to whether, when the proposed rule came out, they said, hey, if you're using an external service provider and they're helping you with CMMC, they need to be CMMC certified. Now, big picture, that is a good idea. That is probably the way that things ought to be.
One MSP might have 100 clients. You compromise one MSP, SolarWinds is a great example of that.
Yeah.
But you've now disrupted hundreds or thousands of
100% MSPs. Yeah. The fact, I've said this before in other, even talking in other sectors and webinars and podcasts and other sector relevant regulations, the idea that the infrastructure people behind critical infrastructure, the MSPs that service all these sectors, are themselves not considered critical infrastructure, themselves not considered.
Kind of shocking, right?
It's completely absurd, right? It's completely absurd. So it was very good to see that the DoD and the proposed rule sort of take a swing for the fences here and say MSPs need to be certified. Didn't make it until the final rule. I secretly think that probably is a indicator of what's coming in the future.
Maybe a 3.0. CMMC
Let's talk about that. Hold on. Let's talk about 3.0 in a second. In the chat, you guys want to hear about CMMC? The final rule's been out for 4 hours.
That's right. We're already revising it.
I'll talk about it. You guys want to hear about 3.0? Let us know in the chat, and we'll get through these notes here on MSPs real quick. So the thing was, the proposed rule came up with this idea of security protection data, and this security relevant data was considered to be controlled and classified information. And if you deal with controlled and classified information, you need a CMMC certification. Who deals with security protection data? SPD. MSPs deal with SPD. Therefore, MSPs deal with CUI. Therefore, they need the CMMC cert, right? Well, that didn't make it into the rule. Now, MSP certification is optional. But in many ways, that's a worse situation, right? So we're back to where we were before the proposed rule, saying, okay, you're dealing with external service providers, and they don't need to have a certification. When your MSP doesn't have a CMMC certification, they are still going to have to sit with you through your assessment and walk through all of the details in your shared responsibility matrix according to 800-171A.
Yep.
I don't know if you got it. Let's pull it up here. I think you got it.
I do. I've got the crosswalk here.
And so as a result, the administrative burden on MSPs for supporting DoD contractors is much, much higher without a provision for an MSP certification. And so some MSPs are going to hear, oh, this is great, we don't have to get certified. And they're going to not realize that we went out of the frying pan and into the fire here, because the amount of work you have to do is actually more without having a CMMC certification stand in for all of these things that you have to show during an assessment.
Yep. Now you're like, what, 40, 80 hours per client per assessment to prep and walk through. Now, you should have somewhat of a unified SRM, but still, you can't just show an assessor your cert and say, hey, we're good to go, and we're supporting them, right? Yeah, it actually did get a lot harder from a pure labor perspective for MSPs.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, let's see here. Okay, so so this is not to freak anybody out, not to discourage anybody, not to say what's going on, blah, blah, blah. What you'll notice in part of the rule is in the sections where they talk about CMMC level 3, NIST SP 800-172, one of the features of NIST SP 800-172 are organizationally defined parameters. You can check our YouTube channel. Jason and I had a podcast episode not too long ago going into excruciating detail about what an ODP is and how they work. So in the rule, they define the ODPs for 800-172. What are the variables that DoD will accept for your implementation of those requirements? NIST SP 800-171 Rev 2 does not have ODPs in it as it is currently formatted, but they are under the surface, and those have been revealed to everyone in 800-171 Revision 3, which became final several months ago. And so this CMMC rule is creating a policy that will verify the implementation of 800-171 Revision 2. The DoD issued a class deviation not that long ago saying, hey, DFAR 7012 is going to make you implement 171 Rev 2. Don't worry about Rev 3 yet. Well, Rev 3 is the new standard. So how will DoD require people to implement it? How will they verify that you have implemented it? Does anybody know? Is anybody in chat? Can you guess? More rulemaking.
Hey!
So we're going to get a lot of use out of these lights because the policy that is contained in 32 CFR now points to 171 Rev 2. In the future, it will point to 171 Rev 3, Rev 4, Rev 5, Rev 50, however long we're using that standard to be verified by CMMC. The thing to know about that future rulemaking is it won't take as long as the rulemaking did to establish the policy because you're simply revising it. And so if you think this is a temporary thing, if you think you're going to do your implementation, you're going to be good forever and you won't have to touch it again, this is going to be an ongoing process forever. So
I've heard of some interesting things. I had a call with a Canadian organization this week, and they were touting that they're going to have to do, from a reciprocity perspective, Rev 3 of NIST 800-171. So it'll be really interesting if these other countries go ahead and leapfrog the DoD and they end up getting reciprocity with CMMC by doing a Rev 3 implementation. So that is not written anywhere. That is all, hearsay from conversations. But yeah, it's coming. Other countries might adopt it first, ironically enough.
Yeah, absolutely. But for now, we're all celebrating. We're happy crying. We're sad crying. Wherever you are watching this, we're all crying in one way or another. It's 171 Rev 2 for CMMC Level 2 is the standing policy for the foreseeable future. Let's see. Peter said, any advice for small businesses in the DIB supply chain? All right, Daniel, here we are. The thing that we've been telling people about for years and years has finally happened.
Yep.
What advice do you have for people who are finding out about this?
Data flow. Figure out where you get CUI, what contracts are impacted, and what systems are going to be in scope. From there, we can figure out if you have to do an enclave or an all-in approach. And all-enclave is going to be a fair amount cheaper, typically. And an all-in approach is going to be lifting and shifting your whole organization. But it really comes down to data flow. The very first recommendation is do a search for CUI. And we have some keywords. And if you want a list of those, feel free to email me or message me on LinkedIn. Search your existing Google M365 tenants and just start enumerating and identifying this data and start doing interviews, figuring out where it's moving in the organization. And then you need to figure out very quickly, okay, this cloud's in scope, this cloud service, this printer, this mobile phone, this computer. And then from there, we can kind of quickly figure out, okay, what do you have to migrate? What do you not have to migrate? What do you have to harden and secure? What do you not? And build up a plan pretty quick. That would be the recommendation. Jacob just dropped the Pathfinder tool in place that our team has been working on for a long time. So help you with that decision tree of what do I do now if it's an emergency and I need to get compliant yesterday versus all the way down to what's the long-term thing that I might need to do as I need to extend that data flow throughout my whole organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. David said in the last podcast, we were talking about the DIBCAC Access database. So last week on the live stream, if you're new here, we do this every Friday. The lights aren't always here every Friday because we don't get a final rule every Friday.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that'd be crazy.
This is a special occasion, but we do this every Friday. And last week we were talking about the fact that one of the resources that you hear about from DoD all the time is a tool called Project Spectrum. And they have a self-assessment scoring tool in accordance with the scoring system that we were mentioning earlier, the weighted requirements in NIST SP 800-171. And they had a web-based tool. You answer all the questions, and then it spits out a score. Well, due to recent events beyond human comprehension, the Project Spectrum tool no longer calculates that score. So your only option is the tool hosted on the DoD DIBCAC website, DIBCAC being DoD's team of full-time employee auditors for cybersecurity. And so if you go to their website, then you will see a link to an Access database file.
Crazy. They're still making those, by the way.
I mean,
but
it is clunky and hideous and ugly, but it does the job. And so when you download it, you can walk through this database and it has all the controls, all of the assessment objectives in 800-171A, which, Peter, if you're still around, the most important concept for you to remember is that the verification of your requirements is done with a document called 800-171A. This is contained in the CMMC assessment guide by another name, so don't worry about that. But you have more than 110 questions to answer to prove that you've implemented your 110 requirements. And the only tool that we know of from the government that is free and available is this Access database. And if you walk through all the questions, then it will calculate your score properly. And by properly, I mean, if you haven't implemented all of the questions, the 320 questions for the 110 requirements, you don't get the points for those requirements. You have more than one question that needs to be answered in order to get the points. So is it worth your time to investigate self-scoring your environments with this database? Yes. Yes, especially if you have a smaller environment, you're looking to get started, you're looking for a free tool. We had some people on last week saying that they've tried it and it is not what they would consider to be enterprise ready. So if you're coordinating a large team, large environment, lots of stuff going on, you're probably going to need something that's a little bit more robust. We've got a lot of experience walking people through our projects using some tools that are a lot more polished than an Access database. But if you're
shout out to Future Feed there, so
100%. But if you're just trying to get started, trying to figure out what's going on, that is the current most authoritative and correctly operating free tool from the government. All right, let's see here.
Right, Shannon. Access still works.
Access still works. It does still work. Absolutely. All right, Wendy's here. Hey, Wendy. All right, she says, hey, this is interesting. Phase 1 begins on the effective date of this 32 CFR CMC Part 70 program rule or complementary 48 CFR 2FR, whichever occurs later. Okay, so like we were talking about earlier, the 32 CFR rule and 48 CFR rule are two sides of the same coin. So in order to implement the CMMC policy, you need the 32 CFR CMMC rule. In order to implement those policy requirements in contracts, you need the 48 CFR rule because acquisition contract clauses are themselves regulations. They are contained in Title 48 and policies for the DoD are contained in Title 32. That's just where they live, right? So the problem here is that the 32 CFR rule is being promulgated by the DoD CIO's office. The 48 CFR rule is being promulgated by a different office in the Pentagon. They are not the same office, not the same team. It's a bad case of left hand, right hand-ism. And the original intention was for these rules to fire off at the same time. When they announced CMMC 2.0 rulemaking, and they said, we're going to add this 32 CFR rule on top of this 48 CFR rulemaking. They said, hey, these are going to happen basically right in line with each other. Well, one thing led to another, and they didn't fire off at the same time. So now we have the 32 CFR final rule. Its effective date should be 60 days from its official publication date. So its official publication date will be Tuesday, October 15th, which should put the effective date December 14th to December 15th. The 48 CFR rule is still in its public comment period on its proposed rule. Its public comment period, ironically, ends on the official publication date of the 32 CFR rule. So if the 48 CFR rule takes as long as the 32 CFR rule did, 201 business days, to go from proposed rule to final rule, it would be done in June of 2025. I don't think it's going to take that long for a lot of reasons. It's smaller, it's simpler, it's more straightforward. There is a fraction of the number of comments. The scope is much narrower. So I don't think it's going to take until June. But the phase one, first phase of the rollout of CMMC and contracts won't occur until the effective date of the 48 rule, not the 32 rule.
Jeremy Gold just had an interesting question. Going back to the tool stack for MSPs, you only are going to have to replace cloud tools with FedRAMP solutions if they're going to process, store, or transmit CUI. Or you can reconfigure non-FedRAMP tools to disable the ability to process, store, or transmit CUI. So there's really kind of two ways to look at it. Either replace the tool stack so you can process, store, or transmit CUI, or disable that functionality like EDR sandboxing, spam filters, right? Like you can't, I mean, that's going to be a data flow. So that's going to be really hard, if at all possible, to leave out of scope. You've got RMM tools for file sharing, screen capture. Again, problematic. You have to go through and disable these things, or you have to move to a compliant version. So it definitely disrupts the tech stack a good bit in the sense of the type of work you're doing. So I would definitely recommend looking at your own data flow with what you're doing, how you're moving data from your clients into your systems that you support, and figure out, okay, is there going to be CUI in here or not? Can we disable it? Or can we write a policy around it, right? So there's a lot of things to think about there as it relates to swapping out parts or all of your tech stack, kind of depending on what that full scope looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, just a quick reminder for everybody. This is just our initial reaction to the rule dropping literally a couple hours ago. So we're going to have everything summed up, everything visualized, everything packaged up nice, neat, and clean in about 45 minutes or so at on a webinar, official Summit 7 webinar on November 7th. You can register with that link that's in chat. It's pinned to the top of YouTube. It's in the chat on LinkedIn. The URL is here on screen. So if you miss the information, if you're feeling like you're missing out on all the stuff that's flying around over the weekend, the many posts that are going to be coming out on LinkedIn over the next couple of weeks, the spam that's going to be showing up in your email inbox. I mean, that's going to be the worst part, right? For the most part, we have been in rulemaking winter for the last almost 3 years. And so the only people that have really been talking about this stuff are the people who really know what's going on. And if you weren't around circa 2019, 2020, you probably don't remember the overwhelming tidal wave of complete freaking nonsense that was just washing over the DIB in emails, in phone calls, pamphlets being dropped out of airplanes, those banner airplanes flying over the beach on the weekends. CMMC, signs on the road, just total nonsense everywhere. Well, like the cicada wave earlier this year, was that last year? They're all going to wake up and be back in your inbox here pretty soon. So, Peter, I know you're new here. Check out the Pathfinder tool. If you hear anything that seems too good to be true when it comes to this stuff, it probably is. The age-old adage is
CMMC in 24 hours or 48 hours or even in a month. Run away from those people. I mean, in all honesty.
Absolutely. I mean, people in the DIB are famous and very good at being frugal and scrupulous business people, right? You're running small businesses, you got small margins, you're in a very specialty environment, right? You have to be discerning with the decisions that you make about all kinds of stuff. So don't let all the things that make you a great business go out the window when you hear something that is too good to be true when it comes to this stuff, just because it's like cybersecurity, technical, weird regulatory thing doesn't make it any different in terms of how you're evaluating it from a business perspective. Do your research, check out the resources. At this point, I think we're at over 75 hours of podcasts over the last 2 years of just free information to check it out. Check out our YouTube page, check out our webpage, follow me on LinkedIn, follow Summit 7 on LinkedIn. It's all free. It's all free information. You can stop by here every Friday and ask us questions, and we can help you get started from there. All righty, let's see here.
What else we got? RN posted a question about DibCAC. Let me see here. I think it was DibCAC earlier today.
There was a question in here. Let me see if there was a question in here about JSVA conversion.
Yeah, 1205.
Find it. Yeah, let me see if I can find it here. Okay. Like I said, we're going to cover all this stuff on the webinar, so if you miss it, no big deal. So they said, does section 170.20 standards acceptance, paragraph A, subparagraph 1, imply that only joint surveillance assessments are eligible for conversion, or will perfect DCMA DibCAC high assessments also be eligible? So very quickly, they're both, because a joint surveillance assessment is considered a DibCAC high assessment because DibCAC is running it. But yeah. One thing to note about joint surveillance is we should probably put this out here instead of waiting for the webinar. Conversion of a joint surveillance assessment that meets the proper criteria and proper scoring to a CMMC level 2 certification, that joint surveillance assessment needs to be done before the effective date of this rule. So on Tuesday, when the rule is officially published, double check the effective date, because if your joint surveillance assessment is scheduled for after the effective date, it isn't going to convert according to the way that the policy
is
good.
I did not know that. Yeah.
So if you haven't scheduled a joint surveillance assessment yet, call somebody in a hurry, because you need to get it done probably before December 15th. And I'm not so sure that there's enough capacity for people to be able to do that. So people who did your joint surveillance assessments, you turned your paper in ahead in order to get grades before the official deadline. Your bet has paid off in the sense that your certification is probably going to convert just fine. All righty, let's see here. Okay, let's see. So we're at about 50 minutes. If anybody has any extra questions, let us know. Let's see, a couple notes here. They defined ODPs for CMMC level 3, which I think is an indicator of what they're going to do in CMMC 3.0, 171 revision 3. They are not afraid to define ODPs as policy. POEM items are still the same. POEMs are still 180 days. There's a lot of time spent in the policy section, 170.5, on the roles and responsibilities of the DoD CIO, the CAICO, the AB, the training requirements for CCAs, CCBs, lead instructors, things like that. So if that's relevant to you in terms of your role in the ecosystem, be sure to familiarize yourself with that section. I am sure on the AB Town Hall, they're going to go into detail on that information. And now, after the monthly AB Town Hall, we will have a podcast dedicated to covering the information that they put out in the Town Hall with Jason Sprosser and Joy Beeland. You can find it on our YouTube page. So if you missed the Town Hall Tuesday evenings, then check out the podcast and they'll catch you up on all the information that you need to know from there. All right. Ingrid said, happy rule day to those who celebrate.
That's awesome.
Oh, man. All righty. Let's see here. Any other thoughts you got, Daniel? Let me scroll through. There's a lot of questions in here.
Yeah,
it is popping.
Security protection data not having to be FedRAMP anymore is a pretty big one. That's pretty new information. So that, again, that kind of helps MSPs as well as regular, traditional contractors not having to use FedRAMP security tools and things like that. As long as they're not processing, storing, or transmitting CUI. So that was a big change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Sean, his name isn't popping up on here, but Sean was talking about people in chat. We're talking about effective date of the new rule. So the effective date will officially be out when the rule is published on Tuesday. Should be 60 calendar days after the publication date of the final rule, which should be December 15th.
And assessments can start then, right, Jacob?
So theoretically, yes. Theoretically, at that point, the policy is good to go. Now, whether there is additional red tape that has to happen in terms of like, oh, DoD needs a signature for that, or the AB needs to release a thing or whatever, we don't know. We'll have to listen to the AB Town Hall. We'll have to keep our eyes peeled for any events that are coming out from the DoD. I'm sure that there's going to be stuff like, oh, We have to turn on the EMAS system in order to upload the system. There's going to be other things that they have to mop up for the assessments to begin, but do not let that dissuade you, because if you were to call a C3PAO right now, if you were to mute this stream and call a C3PAO, they're going to tell you we can't get started until May. And so if you say, well, they still have to do this and they still have to do that, and they have 60 days before it's effective, the amount of time it would take you to get started on your assessment is much, much longer than the 1 or 2 things that the DoD has left to flip switches on in the next 60 days. Right? You can't get an assessment in the next 60 days, even if you wanted to. And if you haven't started implementation, there's a good chance you might not be able to kick off a project, depending on which solution provider you go with, in the next 60 days either. So do not let any of the, they need to do this, they need to do that. The rule is done. The final rule is done. So by the time you are ready to go, all that stuff will already be fixed. It's not a question of like, is this going to be DoD policy or not? It is DoD policy now. Now it's like, we got to turn this system on. We got to calibrate this thing or whatever. We are in a different world now.
Megan mentioned, is it 60 calendar days or 60 congressional legislative days?
Yes. Okay. So the effective date of the rule will be 60 calendar days after the publication of the rule in the Federal Register. Sometimes people will hear discussions about 60 legislative days when it comes to what is known as the Congressional Review Act. The Congressional Review Act is a thing that is used for all major rules that are published from any agency at any time. It's been around since, I think, 1996. And this basically says that rules all go into effect if they're major rules, unless Congress has a universal vote in both houses to deny them, which has happened like once.
Oh, wow.
The other thing that was interesting,
Congress is going to come and veto this thing.
No, yeah. If your justification now is, they still have things to do over the next 60 days, that's not a good justification. No. If it's, I'm going to get a waiver, that's not a good justification. If it's, we're going to get self-assessment, that's not a good idea. If it is, the Congressional Review Act, I would encourage you to read about the Congressional Review Act. In fact, I've been doing a lot of reading about the Congressional Review Act. And what I have found is it is extremely complicated. The word that jumped out to me the most when I was reading this book on rulemaking, highly recommended, by the way, Kerwin and Furlong on rulemaking.
Cornelius Kerwin.
The word that they use when it comes to agencies interacting with Congress via the Congressional Review Act is nonchalance. It is routine. It is a nonchalant
checkbox activity.
This is a standard piece of red tape that happens. The interesting thing about legislative days when it comes to the Congressional Review Act is that a legislative day is not necessarily a calendar day when Congress is in session. It has to do with when Congress is adjourned or not, but they don't count when they're at recess versus just adjournment. And so a legislative day is sometimes longer than a calendar day. A legislative day could be like a week, right?
Interesting.
So it's very, very difficult to actually know and calculate when those legislative days are. That review period extends usually far beyond the effective date of the rule. And you don't know what that actual day is because of look back periods and ways that it gets handed off. So the rule will go into effect. It will be official DoD policy and things will start to fire off, even though the legislative 60-day period is still open technically, because that's just how the machine of rulemaking works when it comes to this red tape after final rules are published. But yeah, effective date will be 60 calendar days. Congressional Review Act is 60 legislative days, which is a much more complicated calculation. Alrighty. Brad said, do these books have pictures?
They need them.
No, they do not have pictures. They are very, well, actually, no, they do not have pictures. They do not have pictures. They have many, many Post-it notes from my reading over the year.
Jacob's
this
pictures.
One is the best one, though. If you want to know what just happened, read this book. If you don't have time to read that book and you don't have time to read the rule, check out our webinar on November 11th. We're going to have a webinar that talks all about this stuff. You don't need to learn how rulemaking works. Nope. You don't even need to really read the rule. We'll do it for you.
Yep. There you go. What a great way to end the episode, Jacob.
There you go. All right, everybody. Well, that's been an hour. The rule's been out for basically an hour. We're going to keep reading through it. We're going to keep going through everything. The link to our webinar registration is in the chat. And we're going to do this Q&A next week like we do every Friday. We're going to have all the podcasts coming out talking about what's going on. If you're finding this stream afterward, let us know in the chat if you have questions, things that you came across in the rule that you think are interesting, things that you came across in the rule that you don't like. For the most part, in Discord, Reddit, LinkedIn, comments, DMs, and things like that, the immediate reception, the initial reception seems to be mostly positive. A lot of people who are very well read into the various rules as they have occurred over the years are saying that a lot of the changes that they've seen in the rule, they like. So it seems like they did a good job on this one. But let us know in the chat if you find this afterwards, and we'll see you next Friday.
See y'all later. Have a good one. Happy reading.
Happy Rule Day, everybody.